Section 3. Disassembly. This segment details the proper method for removal of individual components that make up the long block engine assembly. Those of you who work on or are familiar with engines that are not shown in this project will easily be able to relate the components depicted to your own parts and their arrangements.
In order to start taking them apart, most engines have to be on the floor or on dolly wheels for you to be able to deal with the flex plate or flywheel. Don't put it on a stand yet. Most engine stands make it difficult to get at the back of the block. If you don't have dolly wheels, you should at least have the block sitting on the ground, and you'll need to support it at 3 points. If you have a manual transmission, you need to get your clutch plate and disc off of the flywheel before we start.
A good place to begin disassembling is the center bolt. The flywheel or flex plate is connected directly to the rear of the crankshaft. The harmonic balancer and main pulley are connected to the front of the crankshaft. The center bolt holds the balancer and pulley in place. All of these components spin together as one piece.
The center bolts usually tighten to a really high torque setting, so loosening it means that you need to stop the crank from moving while you apply the pressure. Stick a big flathead screwdriver between two of the teeth of the flex plate or the flywheel, and one of the alignment dowels in the block will keep the crank from spinning as you loosen the center bolt with a breaker bar or a nice big half-inch drive ratchet wrench. Using the same screwdriver technique to hold the plate still, use a big wrench and loosen the bolts that connect the flywheel or flex plate to the crank.
From this point on, every bolt that comes out of the engine should go into some sort of container. You can use sandwich baggies, Tupperware, or some special organizing bin. The important thing is to be able to write down where the bolts came from. We used an organizer bin from the hardware store and labeled the drawers with the names of the engine components so we could keep all of our bolts grouped accordingly.
Once the flex plate or flywheel is out of the way, you can start to think about putting the engine on a stand. The entire weight of the motor is going to be supported by the few bolts that connect the block to the stand, so it's imperative to only use high-quality grade 8 bolts. Be aware that an engine stand might be too wide to fit through a standard-sized door if you need to get your motor inside. Some kind of dolly wheels or an engine cradle would solve that problem. Once you're inside or under some shelter, you can hoist the engine to a stand, and then any dolly wheels or block support can be cleared out of the way. Now for the fun, let's get dirty. How about we start with the oil? When you pull the plug, make sure that you're draining into a container that's going to hold oil and oil only. When it gets full, you can take the used oil to some kind of recycling facility. One of our engines came out of a boat that had some serious problems reported. Everything looked fine on the outside, but our first clue that something had really gone wrong was after pulling the oil pan drain plug. After a solid stream of salt water followed by nothing resembling oil, we figured there'd probably be some troubleshooting involved later. On most engines, getting the oil filter off isn't usually very easy to do by hand. There's all kinds of different oil filter wrenches that you can use, but if you don't have one handy, skip it and just hammer a long, thin Phillips head screwdriver right through it. Look out though, they squirt when you stake them. Make sure it goes through both sides of the filter, and now you have a nice lever to get even the most stubborn ones to start turning. Keep that catch container right under the filter. This can get messy. After you have the filter out and the oil pan's drained, then take the little plug and put it back in so that you can stop all the little drips. Next up, even though we drained the radiator, there's still quite a bit of water in the block itself. Somewhere on either side of the block, down near the oil pan rail, there'll be some plugs. These are the drains that let the water out. Sometimes these guys are tough to get off. Slipping a pipe over our socket wrench gave us enough leverage on one of the motors, but on another engine, the plugs had Allen bolt heads, and even without a pipe helper, we stripped out the plug. The strip plug is just going to have to wait until later. If yours came out okay, have some kind of bucket ready. If your engine has some miles and some grime on it, then when you pull this plug, it's most likely just going to trickle a little bit. If you get a screwdriver and give the hole a good poke, then the rest of the water jacket should empty itself pretty quick. After draining, those plugs can go back in and keep the water drips at a minimum too.
If you have accessories that have a V-style belt, there will usually be some type of pivot bolt and one or a few other locking bolts. Loosen them until you can get the accessory to pivot, allowing slack in the belt. When you pull off the belts, you should keep them in the same order they were on the engine. Wrap them in place with some tape and label which way the front of the engine is. Only do this if you think the belts are reusable.
If your engine has a serpentine-style belt, loosen the bolts for the tensioner and there should be enough slack on the belt to remove it from the pulleys. If your fan is still in place, you can remove it now as well as the water pump pulley that's behind it. If your alternator is still there, you could pull it next. Some types of engines have hidden spacers in different places to line up brackets and pumps and pulleys. On this engine, there was a little hidden spacer behind the alternator bracket. Every engine design is different. Keep an eye out for little particular arrangements of accessories and brackets as they come off. As mentioned before, during the removal, this is a great place to take notes, draw diagrams, or take pictures even. All the bolts and any loose pieces like that little spacer have to go into an organizing bin or some kind of bags that are labeled. Wherever you can, leave exterior accessory pieces connected to ease the reassembly later on. Any nuts or bolts that can go right back where they came from after the accessory is pulled will be helpful. If your engine has a mechanical fuel pump, it's a pretty easy one to pull. If there's a steel fuel line, you should disconnect it first. On some engines, when you're pulling it out, you need to work it around the lever that's attached to it. On other engines, there's this fuel pump cover plate with a rod that hides behind it that gets pushed on by the camshaft. Get ready for it or it'll drop out on its own. The boat motor gave us another hint that there was something interesting going on inside it. You could do your water pump next. If you want to get some pulleys off easily, take your actual fan belt, run it around 2 of the pulleys, and then you'll be able to loosen all the bolts. The pump itself is usually pretty straightforward. Pull the bolts, give it a whack or 2, and it'll be free to go. You might as well get the main pulley off while you're in this area. Keep these main pulley bolts handy. Now you can see the harmonic balancer, sometimes it's called the damper.
The balancer on many engines is pressed onto the nose of the crankshaft and can't be pulled off by hand. You need to use a harmonic balancer removal tool that will thread into the same holes the pulley was held by. If the crank starts to spin, you can try to jerk the bolt once or twice, or turn even slower.
If you don't have a way to keep the removal tool from spinning, don't worry. We can wait and remove the balancer later after the oil pan's removed. Moving to the exhaust manifolds, there were a few air conditioning bracket pieces on this engine that come off along with some of the manifold bolts. Make sure you label the order that the bolts were installed in situations like this. Only use 6-point tools here. It'll lessen the chance of stripping the head off of one of the bolts. The hose and tubes in the top of these manifolds are part of this motor's air pump system. We just left them attached to the manifolds. When the plug wires are out of the way, we've got a clear shot at the spark plugs. As you pull them, keep them in the same order that they were installed in the heads. If you notice any super dirty or damaged plugs, you'll be able to trace them back to a particular cylinder or a set of valves as long as you keep them in the same order that they were in the motor. If a plug or 2 are corroded and they just break off in the head like a few did on our boat motor, you might as well just leave them for the machine shop to deal with later. Now take a look at the distributor where it meets the block. There's one bolt that pushes on a clamp that holds the distributor in place. Pull the bolt, pull the clamp, and then the distributor comes out. It's usually pretty easy, but of course on our marine engine there was so much internal corrosion that we had to use a pry bar to get that one to slide out. When it's time to deal with the intake, every scenario is going to be different in this area of the engine. Sometimes the carburetor and intake manifold can come off before the valve covers. Clearing the carb off our marine engine gave us some better hints to what went wrong. On some engines, and in this case, the valve covers will block the intake manifold from lifting off until the covers are clear. After some prying and tapping, the covers came off, and whoa, we didn't expect to see something like that either. This is going to get good once we get inside this thing, but back to that tragedy later. In the case of fuel-injected motors, a lot of times you can leave the whole fuel delivery system bolted to the intake manifold and remove everything as one piece. If your covers come off after the intake, you'll usually need to tap and pry at the valve covers a little bit to break the seal. Be careful not to bend the covers themselves too badly. After you pull the bolts on the intake manifold, it's helpful to have a putty knife or a thin blade gasket scraper to tap in between the cylinder head and the intake manifold. Follow that with a tap between the block and the intake to break the seal and loosen it enough to lift it off. You should be careful with cast iron intake manifolds. They're really heavy. You might also need a scraper to get the intake gaskets off. Sometimes they stick to the head, sometimes they stay on the manifold. On the back rail of this block, there was a little fitting for the oil pressure gauge that we pulled off. The marine engine had a fitting in the block. Just make sure to clear out any of these sending units or sensors and take notes if you need to. Oh yeah, what was under the intake of the boat motor, you might ask? Well, you might have guessed that one. Hopefully your situation doesn't look quite as bad as this, but in any case, the next thing to do is to get the valve train apart.
The valve train is made up of all the parts that are associated with the opening and closing of the valves. The valve train controls the mechanical timing of these events. The camshaft, lifters, push rods, rocker arms, valve springs, and the valves themselves all make up the valve train.
To take all this apart, we start with the rocker arm nuts. Some engines have rocker shafts that the rocker arms are mounted to. The entire shaft is usually unbolted and lifted off as one piece. There's one extremely important tip to know before you ever pull apart any pieces of the valve train. When the valve train is taken apart, everything has to be organized so that during reassembly, the parts will go back into the exact same positions that they came from. Otherwise, excessive wear will happen if the parts aren't matched back to their original placements and paired with their companion parts. However, this only applies to parts that are going to be reused. If you get new components, they can be mismatched. Goodson Tools has a great valve train organizer tray that'll keep all the loose parts in the right order. As the rocker arms come off, make sure the pivot ball that's under the rocker nut stays with its respective rocker arm. It was an easy decision that the rockers on the marine engine would need to be cleaned in a hot tank at the machine shop, so they all went onto a wire hanger to keep them in the same order for when it comes time to put it all back together. If you put a washer or some other kind of metal label on one end of the strand, you'll know which rockers are supposed to go back on the forward or rear part of each cylinder head. As the push rods come out, you need to make sure the upper end stays in the up position. If these go back in upside down or get mixed up, they're going to wear out a lot quicker. When it comes time for lifters, Craftsman makes a nice pick set that makes pulling clean lifters out a lot easier. You could also use a small flathead screwdriver. On the marine engine, we had to do a little surgery. Considering that most rebuilds require replacement of the lifters and camshaft, all the lifters that we could find on this motor went in the trash. If any or all of your lifters are gummed up really bad with dirty oil and don't want to come out, just leave them in the stuck position and we'll remove them from the bottom after the cam is out of the way. The ones that do come out should go right into some kind of organizer tray if you think they might be reusable. Later, we'll have a closer look to see if they're any good or not.
With the upper valve train out of the way, we can unbolt the cylinder heads. Some of the bolts are under where the valve covers were, and the others are outside near where the spark plugs used to be. Get these bolts into a bag or bin, but don't pull them all. On each head, you want to leave 2 bolts in the corners. They should be threaded in 3 or 4 turns, but not all the way seated.
Make sure before the heads come off that you put some kind of identifying mark on at least one of the heads so you know which side of the block the heads go back to. Put a pry bar or the handle of a long socket wrench in one of the intake port openings of the head and give it a solid shove. Don't push too hard. You don't want to damage the inside of the intake port or your tool. Double check that the safety pin is in your engine stand so that the weight of the engine doesn't shift when you pull just one of the heads. Now take out the safety bolts. Put a few fingers in one of the intake ports and your other hand in an exhaust port. Get a good grip. Lift the heads directly off. Cylinder heads are also very heavy, so be careful, especially if you have a big block. Once they're off, we get a glimpse of the conditions that were inside the combustion chamber. These crusty flakes are burned oil, which is a good indication of worn valve guides. These brownish, rusty spots on the head gasket, where the water flows between the block and the head, is a symptom of the multiple overheats that this motor had experienced. Keep an eye out for the gaskets. Sometimes they stuck to the heads, sometimes they're stuck on the block. Once the heads were off the marine engine, we saw even more signs of the problem that it had. Every cylinder was full of ocean water. But for now, on to the short block.
Before we can get a look at the rotating assembly, which consists of the crankshaft, connecting rods, and pistons, we'll need to pull off the oil pan. If your engine had problems, most likely there'll be a layer of oil sludge and possibly metal particles or other foreign objects in the bottom of the oil pan. We want to leave all the evidence intact. so don't rotate the engine upside down just yet.
Start pulling the oil pan bolts and put them into a bin or bag. Pull all of them except for 2 bolts that are in opposite corners from each other. Make sure these 2 are backed out about halfway. Now tap your putty knife or a gasket scraper in a few spots all the way around the pan and start to pry it loose. Soon enough, you'll be able to pry it down until it's resting on just the 2 catch bolts. Now support the pan from the bottom and pull those 2 bolts. Work the pan down to break it away from the old gasket if you need to. It might take a little finessing to get some pans to clear types of internal oil pumps or oil baffles. Right here is where we got the most interesting view of the marine engine. We already knew that a bunch of water had gotten into this engine, and we expected there'd be a pretty serious pile of goo in the bottom of the oil pan, but man, when oil and lots of water meet a rotating crank, this is what happens. As far as the balancer is concerned, this motor is completely seized, so the crank won't even rotate if we tried. The balancer came right off, and back on one of our other engines, this is the one that we weren't able to get the balancer off earlier because the crank kept spinning while we were using the balancer removal tool. Now, with the oil pan off, we stick a hammer handle or something in there to stop the crank from turning. That's how you'll remove the balancer if you couldn't get it off earlier. Now we can see the nose of the crankshaft, and we're clear to get the timing cover off. Of course, as always, all these guys go into a bin. A trusty putty knife or gasket scraper makes popping off timing covers a piece of cake. Now we can see the timing chain, but before we pull it off, let's check the chain stretch and see if it's even worth saving this thing or not. A good repair manual will show you how much flex is acceptable. Our specs said that it's about a 1/2 inch for this engine. Any more flex on the chain and it should be replaced. On one of our other engines, it was pretty easy to tell by eye that the chain was ready for the trash. Some motors only have 1 bolt in the upper gear, and then both the upper and lower gears slide off with the chain as one piece by hand. Other types have multiple bolts that connect the upper gear to the camshaft, and then the upper gear and the chain would come off separate of the lower gear. The lower gear on these types of engines are pressed onto the crankshaft nose. You're going to need a gear puller to remove them. Sometimes auto parts stores rent or even loan out specialty tools like this type of gear puller.
We're about to pull apart the rotating assembly, which includes the crankshaft, connecting rods, and pistons. This is much easier to do with the motor flipped upside down. But remember before you flip it over that there is still probably a bit of water hiding in the block. This is the block that had the stripped water plug, so one side of the block only had a little water left, but the other side still has quite a bit left. This is one of the best reasons to have one of these engine stand trays. There are a few items that need to come off just before the rotating assembly can come apart. Let's have a look at the oil pump.
On this particular engine, it's as easy as it gets. Unscrew the 1 bolt that goes into the rear main cap and pull off the pump. Some pumps have 2 bolts, and even other systems have a few other bolts that hold the pickup tube and screen in place. As our pump came off, you could see the plastic collar that holds the oil pump drive rod onto the pump. If your motor has a windage tray to keep oil from splashing onto the crankshaft, you should remove it now, as well as any kind of internal dipstick tube extension that might be inside the oil pan area. Now we get to this motor's major symptom.
The decision was made to rebuild this particular engine when some knocking noises were heard coming from deep inside the engine. It sounded like this. A spun rod bearing was suspected, and after pulling the oil pan, the suspicion was confirmed. These chunks of metal found in the oil pan used to be bearing shells. They actually used to look just like the ones pictured on the right. This engine had bad valve stem seals and guides, and oil was being burned in the combustion chamber as we noticed before. The oil level got too low, oil pressure dropped, and the rod bearing heated up, got chewed up, and was spit out into the oil pan.
Regardless of the appearance of the connecting rods, you absolutely need to label them before they're removed. You can do this with a number punch set or with a regular old center punch. Having a crank turning socket or a similar tool on your crankshaft is going to be very helpful for the remainder of this rebuild. Alternatively, you could reinstall your balancer and the center bolt if this is going to be your only option for turning the crank. The connecting rod has a cap that will be removed, and then it will need to be replaced in the same orientation. It should be labeled in two places, above and below the parting line of the cap and the rod body. If you like, you can also label the main caps of the block with a punch set. Some kinds of caps are easy to mix up if they don't have a label already.
Now we can start pulling pistons. The number 1 piston has the number 1 connecting rod. Start by unscrewing the nuts for the rod cap. When they're off, you'll need to remove the rod cap. To do this, you will whack on the end of the rod bolts that are pressed into the rod body. You can use a punch, or you can hit the bolts directly if you have a brass hammer.
When the cap separates, you can pull it off by working it back and forth and pulling on it. If you look inside the cap, there should be half of a bearing shell there. If the bearing shell isn't in the cap, it would still be stuck to the rod journal of the crank and you need to pull it off, or it might have fallen. Next, you should slip some protector sleeves onto the rod bolts to keep them from scratching the crankshaft and the cylinder walls as the piston and rod come out. Slip one of the protectors onto each of the rod bolts and make sure they seat all the way. Another little trick is to take 2 of your longest head bolts and thread them in a little bit by hand, and then stretch a few rubber bands across them about an inch or 2 away from the block deck. You could also use some thin wire or string instead if you want. Next up, you'll need a wooden dowel about as thick as a broomstick and maybe 2 feet long. You'll want to move the rod journal of the crank to the center line of the cylinder bore and place your dowel on the piston right about here. Before you start beating on the piston though, consider this.
While a motor is running, the piston rings slowly wear away part of the cylinder wall and create what is called a ridge. Higher mileage and harder worked engines develop more severe ridges than other motors. Carbon buildup also adds thickness to the ridge of a cylinder, but can be removed with a razor blade. A thick ridge can make it more difficult to bang the piston out. Many people believe that a ridge reamer can be used to cut the ridge and ease the piston removal. We don't recommend using this type of tool. They're difficult to use and don't provide a precise cut. Even if they work, you still have to have a machine shop bore out the cylinder. This leaves only one reliable way to get your pistons out of ridged bores.
A bunch of nice solid hits to the dowel in the right spot should have your pistons out in no time. In extreme cases, like with our marine engine, the pistons might be frozen in their bores by a bunch of corrosion. A wooden dowel might not be strong enough for the job here. You might have to switch to a metal rod of some sort and then put some strength into the hammer blows. Occasionally, a piston ring or maybe a piston skirt might break when you're banging out old pistons. This is actually acceptable because you need to consider that to fix the ridge problem, your cylinders are going to have to get bored out, and that would mean that new pistons are going to be needed for the larger bores. Back to a regular scenario, when your pistons do come out, the rubber bands or wires should stop it from dropping and causing any damage to the piston or your bores. Then you can slide the piston out. Be careful not to scratch the cylinder walls with the edges of the connecting rod itself. Moving on to the other pistons, sometimes it helps to start by lightly tapping on the cap on the side to loosen it up a bit. This rod bolt had to be hit pretty hard to get it to separate. When your protector boots are back on the rod bolts, you'll want to line up the rod journal with the bore center line again and bang away until it pops out. If you have to hit the piston really hard to break the rings so that it'll pop out past the ridge, the rubber bands might break or a piece of string or something, so you might want to have a friend there ready to catch it so you don't cause any more damage than necessary. Here's a close-up of one of the rod journals and the damage that was caused by running an engine with a spun rod bearing. This crank had been machined undersized in a previous rebuild, and the damage was so severe to this rod journal that this crank couldn't be saved by having it cut. As the pistons come out, it's nice to keep them in their proper arrangement according to how they were installed in the engine.
A 2-liter bottle rack that you could get from a local convenience store makes a perfect container for 4, 6, and 8-cylinder engines. Put some labels on the side of the container that match the cylinder numbering of your engine.
On to the crankshaft. A nice long breaker bar is the best tool for loosening these bolts. Some blocks have 2 bolts per main cap. A 4-bolt main block, like this one, has 2 on the front and rear main caps, and then 4 per cap on the center 3 main journals that hold the crank in the block. Getting the main caps off can be tricky sometimes, especially if they have long alignment dowels. Just make sure the bolts aren't threaded in and hold them up halfway out of their holes, and then tap on the undersides of the bolt heads. Alternate from bolt to bolt until the caps are clear to pull off. When they're out, you'll find that half of the main bearings are in the caps. If your block has a one-piece rear main seal, you'll need to pull off the adapter and the main seal now. Hopefully, you'll be able to get it past the engine stand adapter. If not, you're going to have to take the block out and set it on the floor so that you can get the crank out. When everything's clear and you're ready to lift out the crank, be aware that crankshafts are heavy and awkward. If it's not easy for you to get a grip on yours and lift it out, then you should get someone to help. The block is upside down right now, so the lower halves of the main bearings were in the main caps that you just pulled off. The upper halves of the main bearings are here in the block. They're the ones that have the oil feed holes in them. Make sure there aren't any bearing halves that are stuck to the crank journals. Removing main bearings from the block is pretty easy. Push them from the center, sometimes just your fingers work. Every now and then you'll have to push on the side of one with a screwdriver. Just be careful not to scratch the bearing if you think it might be reusable. One of the bearings will be larger and have sides on it. That's the thrust bearing. It can get worked out of its groove by slipping a small flathead screwdriver or maybe a pick or something like that into the alignment slot and just prying it up a little bit.
Main bearings can break loose and spin if there's a problem, just like our rod bearings did. A close look at these main bearings showed that a heavy amount of metal shavings were embedded in the soft metal of the bearings. Some was normal engine wear, but on this particular engine, the bulk of it was probably from that spun rod bearing we discovered. Here's a chunk that was still in the oil passage behind the bearing. After comparing these to the rod bearings, the whole set went in the trash. If there are visible patterns of wear on the bearings, or if the copper core is showing through in some areas, they're probably junk. If you're not sure, put them in a box or bin. Put them in the order that they were arranged in the engine, and bring them with you to the machine shop for some more advice.
If your motor has a rope seal or a two-piece rear main seal, you should pull out the other two halves of those. Now it's time to pull the camshaft and deal with any of the stuck lifters you might have had. Make sure the lifters are all pushed out of the way of the cam. With the block inverted, gravity should help keep them out of the way. Reach your hand in the rear of the block and guide the cam out very gently. If you plan on reusing the camshaft bearings, you should make sure that the cam doesn't scrape them up as it's passed through. Once your cam is out, if you have any stuck lifters, now you'll be able to get them out. Almost every rebuild requires that the cam and lifter be replaced. If you think that your cam might be okay to be reused, then wrap it in some thin cardboard or slide it into a tube or something to keep the dust off of it until you can take it to the machine shop or evaluate it.
If you don't have an engine hoist available, this is where you'll need the help of a friend. Lift the block onto the ground or a workbench and lay it in an inverted position. You should remove the engine stand adapters so you can get to the oil gallery plugs at the rear of the block. If they are fitted with the square type plugs, only use the proper hardened steel tool to remove them. Don't use the square part of one of your ratchet wrenches. They may feel stuck. Don't force them to the point of stripping them out. If you have a torch available, you can heat up frozen plugs until they are super hot. Then let them cool and they might be loose enough to pry open. If not, or if they strip, your machine shop will have to get them out for you.
If you were able to get the rear plugs out and you have the hammer-in style plugs in the front of your block, you can pass a metal rod through the oil gallery and bang out the front ones from the rear. Each engine block will have its own particular block plugs in various places. On this block, there's a sneaky hidden plug that can only be banged out after removing the oil pressure sender gauge fitting on the top of the rear of the block. You'll just need to go through your particular block and remove any plug or adapter or fitting that would hinder the cleaning process for you at the machine shop. You may not even have to deal with any of these plugs. Most machine shops will strip down and clean the block for you as part of a standard service package. If you do want to continue yourself, the water jacket freeze plugs come last. They're pretty easy though. Use a punch and drive them into the water jacket area. They'll fall down inside, but you'll be able to grab them. Use something like a pair of large channel lock style pliers and then grab the edge of the plug and just lever it out. If space is tight, hammer the plug to the side until you can grab enough of it to pull on. One last thing, don't forget to remove your water jacket drain plugs. But if you remember, on one of our engines, we ended up stripping one of those. To get it out, we drilled right through it, and then we heated it up with a torch, and then let it cool down so that some of the threads might break loose. Then we banged an extractor tool into the open hole, and just wrenched on it until it finally let loose and threaded out. The only thing that should be left on your block besides paint and dirt are the camshaft bearings. If you think your bearings are reusable, keep in mind that even the cleaning process at any machine shop will leave a gritty residue on the cam bearings. If you have any block work done, metal particles or shavings from the machining process are going to embed themselves in the soft metal of a good bearing and render it useless.
If you have a camshaft bearing tool and know how to use it, you can bang out good or bad bearings before the trip to the machine shop. We would just recommend you have the machine shop remove and install the cam bearings as part of the block service job.
If you know for sure you're going to have your machine shop do a valve job for you, you could just skip the disassembly of the heads and drop them off with everything still installed. If you want to get them apart to have a look for yourself, the first step is to break the seal between the retainer and the keepers.
When the valve is in the head, there are two angled pieces called keepers that fit into the top groove in the valve stem. The spring retainer is held in place by the angled shape of the keepers and the pressure of the spring pushing up on it. When everything is assembled, the valve stays closed.
Over time, the retainer gets stuck to the keepers, and you need to smack on the retainers only, not the valve tip, to break the seal. You can do this with an ordinary deep socket. Sometimes, if you get a good solid hit, a keeper will come loose, and it'll let you pull the whole spring and retainer right off right there. For the rest of the valves, you're going to want to use one of a lot of different types of valve spring compressors. This type of spring compressor is easy to use, but you do need to have strong hands to squeeze it. There's also other types you can get like this one, but they're a lot harder to deal with because they have a tendency to pop off the spring, but whichever tool you decide on, it's going to push the retainer and squish the spring. You'll need to compress the spring far enough so that the keepers will have enough room to slip out past the retainer and the valve tip. Needle nose pliers, or better yet, a magnetic pickup tool, are perfect for grabbing keepers. When they're out, you can release the compressor. Make sure the spring and retainer go immediately into the valve train organizer in their respective slots. If there's some kind of umbrella seal like this one for the valve stem, you can pull it off and just throw it away. There's no reason to ever reuse old seals. Also, if you see a spring shim, you're going to want to put it in the right spot in the organizer tray to stay with its valve as well. Every once in a while, a valve tip will have a burr on it. Grab a fine grade file and carefully rub out the burr, and then you'll be able to slide out the valve. When all the valves are out of the heads and in their proper place in the organizer tray, the disassembly of your motor should be done.